We do have another session here coming up called Dissecting Evidence of Learning by uncovering the meaning of what questions in our courses. What are the questions of the question? Okay, of the what questions in our courses. This is interesting. Okay, mommy, hold on a second. So this conversation builds on the simple SoTL, which is the study of teaching and learning, of what works. So it is also illuminated by the legacy of conversations sparked during the middle stage on-site visit, revolving around the reviewer's question, how do you know what students know? That's a big question. It's rooted in the evaluator's interest to foster an inquiry approach to our teaching and learning. And the SoTL group wants to discuss the following questions as we imagine pedagogy for the next academic year. So the questions that are going to surround this conversation are: what represents evidence of students learning in your course? Are we able to dissect what students are learning in our courses? And do they learn what we propose in the syllabus? So there are ground rules here. Rather than engaging in a philosophical definition of learning, we define learning for the context of this presentation as a specific disciplinary knowledge and skills stated in our syllabus, delineated through stated expectations such as an anticipated course, pathways, or program learning outcomes. And so for this session, we're going to have Jackie DeSanto, who's professor of education, Antonio Suarez, a professor of behavior and social sciences, and Nelson Nunez Rodriguez, professor of natural sciences. Professor?
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Stacy, you can hear me okay? Quick thumbs up, please.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
You
I appreciate it.
Responsibility and a legacy. You carry
There's some background coming in.
Okay. One other bit of housekeeping, Stacy. Until what time? About 11:50, 11:55. Yeah.
Carla? We're going to work for that. Okay, so 11:55. Let's go.
Okay. Again, thank you, Stacy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am Tony Varela, professor of psychology from behavioral and social sciences. I'm joined today by Professor Jackie DeSanto, professor and chair of the Department of Education. Unfortunately, Professor Nelson Nunez Rodriguez couldn't be with us today, professor of in the Department of Natural Sciences, but he's here with us in spirit, as many of these conversations that we've had going back for years are his brainchild, and so we hope we can do justice today in our talk. As Stacy generously outlined for us, our conversation, Dissecting Evidence of Learning by Uncovering the Meaning of the What question in our courses. Unfortunately, what was meant to have quotation marks around it in the program, so it makes the sentence a little bit awkward, but we think this is a really rich and important discussion to have, and so we're happy to have it with everyone this morning. This conversation, as I said a second ago, is a continuation of a discussion that's actually started years ago, certainly pre-pandemic, about what's going on inside of our classrooms, and not only discussing what's going on inside our classrooms, but how to understand what's going on inside our classrooms. So to put it even more simply, what we're trying to understand is what works, what is working inside our classrooms. We describe ourselves as the SoTL Inquiry Group. SoTL stands for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And SoTL as a discipline, its primary focus is to understand the impact of pedagogy. It's pretty simple in that respect, but certainly it's a very rich question and can be asked on a variety of levels. You can pose the question on an institutional level, a departmental level, program levels, but our conversations have typically revolved around our individual classrooms and how we might turn our classrooms and the lessons that we offer into laboratories as a way to unpack, again, what's going on and to understand what works. And so we hope to continue that discussion here. Specifically, what we'd like to talk about is how do you as the faculty expert, the sage on the stage, if you will, how do you know what your students know? How do you know what your students are learning inside your classrooms. Now I'm going to establish, or at least as much as I can here, a ground rule, and that is to define learning for this conversation, because we can get philosophical with this very quickly, and it wouldn't surprise me if we did. But we're going to define learning for this talk as the specific disciplinary knowledge and skills that you want students to acquire in your courses. A lot of this stuff is outlined on our syllabi. Sort of our students are going to acquire these skills. They're going to learn this information. So if we can talk in terms of what you have on that document, what you have in your syllabus, in terms of what we hope our students learn after spending 15 weeks with us in our classes during the semester, we'd like to focus on that. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, who's going to pose some specific questions, but I also wanted to share that we decidedly are going low tech with this, or as low tech in this environment as you can. I don't think we're going to use a lot of the bells and whistles and tools, but that was by design, because this is meant to be a conversation about us and the work that we do. So feel free to open your mic and just jump right in, and again, join in the conversation in that respect. But for a little more structure, I'm going to pass it over to Jackie now, who's going to frame some questions, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion about this. Jackie?
I know I'm muted. I have yet to get the knack of that. Hi, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the day. It has been chock full of great ideas and a lot of sharing. This one's going to be a little bit more work, because you're going to go back into this semester, and I know a lot of us are trying rapidly to bring it to an end and forget about it, because it has been rough in a lot of aspects. I want you to go to a pure spot, and we are going to use Jamboard, because I think a lot of you are going to want to jump in, and this will give you each a chance. But that's about as high tech as we're going. No breakout rooms, I promise. I want you to think right now about what is learning in your classroom. We gave you the general definition, but how do you notice it in your classroom? I'm going to give you 5 minutes, because I want you not only to post your thought, but to look at other people's thoughts and perhaps comment or pose a question. You can tag your post-it right attached or right below somebody else's. We'll bring you right back, and wait. Okay, the Jamboard link is in the chat. And if you cheat and get a glass of water during the 5 minutes, it's okay, but please post your thought first. Oh, all right, if it's asking for access, that's me and not being able to do it. So we'll scratch that. We're going as low tech as it gets.
There you go. You almost turned me into a liar, Jackie. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
you jinxed me. You absolutely jinxed me. Our question is, hold on 1 second, because I have to bring it back up. What represents evidence of student learning in your course, or in one particular course section? Tony's going to be in charge of picking and choosing who gets to answer. It's his job to see who pops up first. So think about it for a second. What represents evidence of student learning in your course?
I'll actually take advantage and go first myself, because again, in preparation of this, we were talking about sort of what we do. And so in my classes, I tend to do a lot of pre-post sort of stuff. So I ask a set of questions that I typically expect students not to be able to answer, because we haven't covered the material yet. And then we have our lessons, we have our discussions, and then the exams effectively serve as a post-test. And so that change in the ability to answer those questions, where before they couldn't, but on the exams they can, to me is among the most low-tech but the most effective ways of assessing, again, learning has taken place. That there's effectively a change in behavior in this context, where before they didn't know X, Y, and Z, but now they do, as evidenced by their ability to answer the question. So, but I see some other hands up. So Alita, I'll go to you first, please. If you can share with us your thoughts.
One of the things that I looked at is a student might have an essay wrong. They did it wrong. They did not know how to write it. They misspelled it. They had a lot of errors. But I wanted to learn, let's say, any item. but they could tell it to me. They could tell it to me in Spanish. They knew the topic, they knew the concept, they knew everything that I wanted them to learn. They could explain it to me in Spanish, or they could explain it to me in English. They could not write it grammatically correct. To me, that was evidence of learning. But we don't do that. They say if they cannot say it in English, and if they cannot say with the right grammar, and they cannot do with the right pronunciation, I'm going to take points off for spelling and grammar. But my SLO said the student will be able to describe, and they describe it to me orally. Why should I take points off? To me, that is evidence of learning.
I would agree with
And
you,
I think
Alita.
we minimize our good teaching when we have poor assessment techniques. We make all this effort to put good lesson plans, and then we put a horrible exam, and we sabotage our good learning, our good teaching.
Can I make a comment to what Alita said?
Surely.
Okay, I think it's great. Just in self-defense, as an English professor, the only time I would take off for spelling or grammar or syntax is if the way it's written interferes with my ability to understand what the student is trying to convey. So, you know, and I was an official Cat W reader, and grammar and sentence structure counted a whole lot less than ideas conveyed, development, and organization. So I'm sorry if you've had.
But what about biology? What about biology? What about dental hygiene, which students are scraping teeth? Should I have those same values when they've learned the topic? It's not English. I'm not talking about English classes.
Yeah, Alita, I think your observation from a learning perspective is quite astute, actually. And one of the principles of learning that, again, I leveraged in my classrooms is the ability to generalize an experience to those outside of the context of the material being presented. And that's effectively what you're doing here. So while a student may not be able to communicate an idea in writing, if they can communicate that idea in another form or to another audience in some other way, that would certainly qualify, I would argue, and I agree with you here, that would certainly qualify as a form of learning. But I think if we go back to where we started this discussion about being discipline specific in terms of what we're trying to teach, you know, there's room for grammar and spelling and punctuation and English and communication in that format as well, if that's indeed what your goal is. But to your point, I think learning certainly is effectively understood by generalization of the behavior to novel situations, which is effectively what you're describing. Linda, you had your hand up, so please, I want to ask you to share.
Thank you. So I'm talking about teaching some pretty complex concepts, or at least new applications of formerly familiar concepts in a new arena. And I think that I know when they haven't learned it, right? And I do that by asking them to either talk about it or write about it. And then I can identify some gaps in their understanding and address those gaps. So I think simply put, that's my approach.
I think that's great, Linda. It actually reflects a comment I think, William, you have here in the chat. So when students repeat concepts or knowledge in their conversations that they've learned in class. So basically when it's spoken back to the class, yeah. So they're communicating information that they weren't aware of before, and that ability to communicate, whatever that form may be, would be evidence of learning. I think is perfectly reasonable. Christine, please.
I find it really helpful, although I would like for students to always be able to do everything all the time, but I find it for me helpful to have specific assignments that have a very special focus on specific important skills. So for example, if I want them to understand this concept, I'll have one assignment that tests their knowledge of, or helps them practice their knowledge of that concept. If I want them to do a thesis, I'll have one assignment that focuses more, actually, because it's so important, on a thesis. And that way, if I can kind of say, okay, for this essay, we're really focusing on sentences and grammar. Let's work on that now. And also for individual students, our target particular trouble areas. This student needs to work on organization. This student needs to work on thesis. And then for those students, I'll have them focus specifically on that. And then I can measure how much progress they've made in that, in those specific discrete skills that are, key to the sort of point of the course.
I think that's a real interesting and important point as well, and to some extent is empirically validated that the more specific and focused our lessons can be, the better, more effective we tend to be at communicating the material, and students in turn are more apt to pick up that material as well. I mean, we have so much we want to share with them. We have so much information we want to convey and so many lessons we want to teach, and it can be overwhelming to the student, but fundamentally, you're exactly right. The more focused you can be, the better the transfer of information and the better the learning seems to be. Cynthia.
Yes, I really want to commend Christine laying it out that way. And it really does help the students take this approach where you're kind of like giving them mini steps, but they're clear about where they're going, what's being targeted. So I really echo what Christine said, and I have to keep that in my mind as I'm doing assignments more so too. Thank you, Christine.
I wanted to ask Stacy if she could elaborate on her point, each one teach one. It sounds cryptic, but yet so important. Stacy, would you mind giving us a little bit more information?
I think it's kind of what people were mentioning before. I'm kind of just reiterating what people were saying, that if we know something or we have an understanding of a concept, an idea, it's easier for us to kind of teach it to someone else. And it's kind of one of the things that I hold true in my classes. If you really get a sense of something, you should be able to express it to someone else. Now, when I mean express it, I don't always mean to be able to always verbalize it perfectly, properly. It doesn't have to exist in perfection. And I always tell my students that it doesn't need to be perfect. But if you can explain something to someone else and they could really get a sense of it, then you've shown that maybe you understand it yourself. Because I find like a lot of the difficulties is when they don't get a concept and they're telling you, I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it. And it's really, they have to kind of own it and appropriate it in a little way and create those examples for themselves, as Tony was saying, be able to reach outside to the next example. But I think this key where they have to be able to tell it to someone else, tell it. They do this in elementary school a lot. It's so weird. There's a lot of elementary school elements in teaching that in college sometimes we ignore the elementary school elements, and maybe going back should probably be useful. Being able to talk out loud, read aloud, talk out loud, speak out loud, and also write out loud too. These are key elements to being able to share what I know. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I think the idea of perfectionism holds a lot of us back too, and so that's what I was like. If you get it, sometimes it's easier to tell someone. Yeah, well, Laura said it comes from proverb and apply to right. Yes, totally.
Laura also put a link in the chat as well that might be of interest to some about, it's an example evidently of each one teach one at play. Carlos had a comment in the chat as well. I use the 5E framework to tackle on their prior knowledge and testing what they learned through the lessons and self-reflect on how their prior knowledge enhanced changed. Carlos, I don't know if you'd like to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. This framework connects a lot with universal design for learning. And the idea is that we planned these conversations throughout the day about the students come with prior knowledge. How do we tackle on that knowledge? And through the content that they're learning, making sure that they apply what they know, or they test their knowledge with the concepts that they're learning, and then applying, creating through project-based learning, activities, conversations, and then have them test. Let them self-reflect on what they learned and whether their prior knowledge changed or enhanced, and then applying to the next modules that they're learning in the class.
Excellent, thank you. Alita, you still have your hands up. Was there anything else you
Oh,
wanted?
no.
Okay. Jackie?
Actually, Cynthia Jones had her hand up, or you took it down. Cynthia, did you want to add something?
No,
Nope.
we seem to
Okay.
be.
All right, we're going to move on to the second question. The second question is, hold on one second, I seem to have lost the second question. My technology is not cooperating with me. Are we able to dissect what students are learning in our courses? Now, this goes beyond how you identify what learning looks like in your classes into, are you able to take that apart? Are you able to get from it what you need to assess the students? So the basic question is, again, are we able to dissect what students are learning in our courses? And feel free to use the chat as well as raising your hand to answer. I'm going to add my 2 cents since Tony went first for the first question. Sometimes it's really hard in our courses because I know in our program we have ILOs, we have PLOs, and we have student learning objectives for each courses. And it's really hard to decide which one am I going to look at. And it's almost impossible to do all of them at the same time. So going back to the people who spoke for the first question about breaking it down, Christine, that was so important what you said, because if we don't break it down and take the time to target one little thing that we're looking for, at the end, the grade is immaterial because we haven't really decided, at least in teacher ed, are they able to go on to the next course? Did they learn anything? I mean, they may pass tests and do wonderful on multiple choice and short answer questions, but did they learn any of the objectives or outcomes that we had hoped they would? Did they move forward in their skills?
Yeah, I was going to say, Jack, I'll add to that. And it's funny because I think there's I don't know the word I want to use, a cloud over this question of, and I hesitate referencing this.
Tony, I'm going to interrupt you. We didn't write the question, Nelson did.
Well, yeah. But we did spend a lot of time for hashing them out, though. There's the issue of modality here. I think fundamentally the answer for all of us, the question is yes. Are you able to dissect what your students are learning? Are they learning the skills that we hope that they acquire in our classes? Are they learning the information, the content? But the ability to ask and answer that question, I think, has changed over the past couple of years regarding with the shift in modality that many of us were required to make as a result of the pandemic, and sort of how that sort of influenced our thinking about pedagogy as well. So I think there's that level to the question that we might benefit from just throwing out there. Alita, please. Yeah.
Yes, we can dissect. We can dissect because every time you give an assessment, you will find out what the individual student doesn't know, but you also find out what the class does not know. And when you find out what the class doesn't know, you have to go and reteach it. And do not say, oh, I taught it already. It's up to them to get it. I taught it so well, I'm not going to teach it again. Because every single exam that you give needs to be deconstructed. Every item has to be looked at, and then find out if the students did not know how to answer this and this questions in the exam. Either I wrote the question wrong, I did not teach it well, or something is wrong, and I now have to reteach it. Because if I don't reteach that particular concept, they cannot do the final exam, or they cannot go to the next year. And these are skills we do not have. We do not have those skills. And now I'm going to put my thing in. We need a fellow. We need fellows in our classrooms to assist us in assessment. And we don't have these fellows. We have work fellows, humanities fellows. We need testing fellows.
Christine, please.
Yeah, sometimes I think that the way I teach is really influenced by probably the most influential learning experience I had, and that is as a musician. I think a lot of what I do is influenced by that process of identifying, like, let's practice vibrato, right? And first you just try to master vibrato, and then you try to master vibrato in the context of, say, a piece of music, right? And you also focus on different kinds of pieces of music, which in my field would be different genres, right? Like in romantic French flute music, or in Bach sonatas, or do scales to keep practicing. So I think I'm thinking very individually. I'm thinking about, we all need to learn how to do X and practice it in isolation, and then practice it in practice in different genres. And then for each student, a sort of separate learning program. Like, this student has vibrato down, but in terms of applying it, they haven't got it yet. So I think that's been really helpful to me, to think about the way music is taught, because I think there's been so much work done among musicians and how learning happens. And it really does isolate separate skills in isolation and then in context. And so I think it's been helpful for me just to think about it that way.
Excellent, thank you. Cynthia, please.
I also think that the student has to be involved in the assessment as opposed to just faculty directed. And what I mean by that is, I think students, when they discover what they've learned and are able to self-assess, it is very helpful to me as I'm moving along during this semester. So I tend to build in student self-assessment places throughout the semester. And then I take all of that together to see what kind of progress has been made. But if the student isn't aware of what they're learning and how that matches with the LOs, then what's the point? So I think having the student engaged in self-assessment is really helpful to the assessment of those LOs.
Excellent.
I just completely failed in technology trying to find this raised hand thing. If you give me just 1 minute, I would like to make my point, if possible.
Please go ahead, Slavia.
Well, I want just to drop a bomb here. First of all, I completely concur with a lot of saying here about the assessment and how that should be mutual and how it should be engaged and so on. My bomb is assessment in the online classes. I am still not comfortable with the assessment we are giving online because there's not substantial proctoring. It's not only that it's prompt to cheating, and the statistics says that's about 10% of the students do cheat on the online assessment. But it's even worse for me because, with the CUNY policies not requiring the camera on, I have no idea who is taking the test. And no hard evidence, but it seems that in some cases it's not the person engaged in the class. So that's the big question in development our further assessment skills. We in class, it's I concur with everyone that was said. We can improve it, we can get it, and that's, I think, is the question of perfecting it, not the question of making it work. For the online course, it's still the question of making it work. Thank you.
Thank you, Slava. Sharice, forgive me, you should have gone next, but let me ask you to go now. Thank you.
No problem. So when we're talking about experiential learning, what about the lack thereof? The students who don't have that experience, we go back to, there's no stupid question, there's no stupid answer. But if they can't contribute to that because they don't have the experience, they can't be a part of the assessment. They're not going to give you what they can orally. They're not going to write anything down because they don't have that experience. So That's my thoughts on it.
I think that's I think that's a really interesting and important point as well, that when we frame learning and understanding whether or not someone has acquired something, whether it's skill or information, that you have to take their history into account in whatever assessment device that you're using to make that determination. And so, yeah, their history or someone's learning history prior to getting to you is relevant to understanding whether or not learning is actually happening. Julie, please.
Hi. Before I get to the point that I will make, I did want to touch on something that Alida said earlier about students being able to communicate effectively orally, but not in writing. This is a particular problem in jargon-heavy disciplines, such as in the sciences. I noticed that years ago that students look like they're plagiarizing a research paper, that you're asking them to do. But when you have them in front of you and asking them, questions about it, they actually know something about it, but they're just terrified to change the language because of the jargon. But getting back to something else, as much as Christine's point is well taken, that there's certain skills that need to be really drilled into students in a very focused manner. But a lot of our courses are continuation courses, so students need to be able to process that information and to start being able to link information, pieces of information, from one course to another, or even within a course, and to be able to then to even synthesize other information. I'm, sometimes even telling students, look, if you get into a nursing program, you're going to be asked to, read a couple chapters, the first day of class, have an exam the next day, and you're not going to just be asked about, like those 2 chapters that you read. Anything that was taught previously, science classes, sociology classes, etc., anything that they feel is fair game that links to that material, you need to be able to draw upon. So the students, yes, they need to, learn individual skills or individual pieces of information, but at some point they also need to be able to link that information together, to process it, to synthesize, to grow beyond that. And so I try in some of my assignments to get at the, those skills, whether it's in the lab report questions that I ask them or discussion board questions, etc.
We've come close to the end of our time. I'm not sure we're going to have time for the last question, but I see Denise, you have your hand up, so I want to give you the last word on this issue, and then I think we'll wrap up with that.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to just say that I think using a variety of assessments will help one to assess a student. Using a reflective document and having students to answer questions that will help them link what they're learning now to their prior knowledge is helpful. Having exams is helpful. Doing critical thinking exercises where they stop and think about what they've learned and how they're going to apply it is helpful. And those are just some examples, but my major point, if we're going to dissect what a student is learning, we might have to do it in different ways, because students learn in different ways and they express themselves in different ways. So a variety of assessment tools, I think, is helpful in one class.
It appears we have a couple more minutes. We've gotten 5 more minutes. So Jackie, I'll turn it over to you for the last question. And
Thank you, Denise. And thank you, Tony. And thank you, Carlos, for giving us extra time. Our final question is, do or did they learn what we proposed in the syllabus? Listening to all of you, I kept thinking, this takes a lot more time than we often have to give. And we hit the 15th week, which we are now, and we're like, I didn't get this, I didn't get this. Do we or do they get to learn what we said they would learn or what we wanted them to learn in the syllabus? Thoughts?
I don't know, Jackie. Sometimes maybe this is a unpopular position, but I sometimes think syllabi are very aspirational in some ways. There's a lot of information we put in there. even though we have 15 weeks, I think a lot of course material is just so much, so big and hard to get at. And a lot of times we can glean over a lot of aspects and focus on some. And faculty do that too. They, you know, as a developmental psychologist, yes, that's my thing. You know, I'll just go in ham on that. And then other people might not, you know. And then and then some people take a position where you should get a gist of most things, right? So that becomes, you know, I guess, license, you know, of the faculty member. I think it's maybe a little different if you have an exam at the end, like, you know, one of those licensing or accreditation exams. It might be different. So, but I do think syllabi we do try to cover a lot in a very short period of time, and then then that's part of the issue, right? How do you make sure that they do understand everything or get it to a certain sense? So that's just my take on that.
I agree with you, Stacy, and I had personal experience. Linda Miles, and I know Linda is here, did an amazing job at a WAC conference where she introduced a writing technique, 7 sentences to get the gist of what you had in an article so the students could bring it to the paper. We got so caught up, we barely finished the start of the second draft, but the students learned so much more than if I had pushed them to get to the final paper. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. Denise, is your hands up? No.
Mine is up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed you. Go ahead.
Under academic freedom, we think we could teach whatever we want to teach. Okay, we could teach whatever we want to teach. Do we have to assess everything we want to assess? And when you have many different classes, psychology, English, even in my discipline, it should not be the individual teacher who decides what the SLOs are. I think the group of teachers who teach psychology should get together and decide this is the critical knowledge. English, these are the critical skills. This is what it needed to be learned in this class. And I, under academic freedom, says, well, I'm teaching psychology. I'm going to teach this and this, and I'm going to assess this and this. Well, I think that is the detrimental of the student, that we pick and choose what is convenient or comfortable or knowledgeable or interested in me or teach, rather than the department collectively in the classes that you will have sequence in decide these are the critical elements that this student must gain after they leave this particular introductory class. And academic freedom gets in the way.
I don't think that's what I said though, but I think
no, I didn't say you said that.
Yeah, we do have our 10 areas that are important and domains, and I think everybody has those domains and areas. I'm just saying sometimes when it becomes the one particular area of expertise, they might be more elaborative in explaining that more so than some other area that's not their expertise. So, you know, it's something, if a subject that they love, somebody might just spend a little more time being very in love with that. And so sometimes that it happens, that's a human aspect, but that doesn't mean that I think people would negate teaching what they have to teach as well. And also time is always a factor for everybody as well. You know, people are people, there's semesters that go really great and you knock out everything. And there's semesters that you're like, oh my God, we're still struggling through this stuff. So that's part of life, I think.
Stacy, thank you. And thank you for wrapping this up for us. We are officially out of time. This has been an invigorating conversation and I appreciate all of you being here. Carlos, back to you or back to Stacy?
Stacy, take it away.
Yes, thank you. So we are going to take a little break right now.